reviews. So, first thing we're going to think about is what is an integrative review? Okay, so has anybody got any idea what an integrative review might be as opposed to a systematic review? Okay, remember we're interactive today. We are not all going to sit there like dummies and look at Jane up the front. We're going to talk to me, all right? Okay, talk to me. What do you think an integrative review might be? Any ideas? What's a systematic review? Does anybody know what a systematic review of the evidence is? Okay, yeah, that's part of a lit review, so including, in fact, systematic reviews are literature reviews of randomized controlled trials, okay? So a systematic review is different to an integrative review. So an integrative review will include both findings from quantitative studies and findings from qualitative studies. So what we can do then is bring together the findings from each of those types of research studies to actually tell a story about a particular area of inquiry that we may have. So it's very important to understand the difference between those. Who does most of the systematic reviews in the world? Who publishes most of the systematic reviews? Do we know? No, not the ABS. The Cochrane collaboration. So some of you will have access to Cochrane Library, no doubt, when you've been doing your assignments. I hope you have been. Okay, so the Cochrane Library is a repository for systematic reviews. And there's a particular protocol about what it means to do a systematic review. And it's a very stringent process and a very difficult one that takes actually a lot of time. Okay. Integrative reviews are also difficult. I won't say that they're easy. And last year we had lots of students that really struggled in this subject with the idea of how to put together a well-structured literature review. Thus today's lecture, okay? So we're going to step this through, and you can see that from our little prezi with the little footsteps. We're going to step through the process of undertaking an integrative review of the literature for your study. So the first thing that you need to do when you're undertaking a literature review is you actually need to write a question you want to find the answer to. Now, this is not a research question. Okay, it differs from a research question because what you're doing is you're actually investigating not so much a sort of a naturalistic sort of setting or something in a lab. What you're investigating is the literature, okay? So the question that you write for your integrative review of the literature won't be the same question necessarily that you might have for your overall study. It will fit into it though, because what you want to do as a result of your integrative review of the literature is you want to come up with some information about who else has done research in this substantive area of inquiry, what type of research has been done, and what were the findings that these people came up with. Can I identify a gap in the literature? So you might have heard that term before. Is there a gap in the literature that my study might fill? Okay, so this is the sort of questions that you're asking when you're setting up the process of undertaking an integrative review. So the very first thing you do is you write a question. So what we're going to do right now, because it's good to be busy together, is in your little groups, you are going to sit down for 10 minutes together and you're going to nut up what you think might be a question that you can answer in your integrative review of the literature. So we're taking the first step towards your assignment for this semester, basically. Thanks, Joanne. That's all right. I've got a couple. So you're going to take 10 minutes to do that. We've got a timer on this amazing setup. Felicity, I wonder? No, I'll time it. And for those of you at home on the recording, you can do this too. Get a piece of paper and write yourself a question. All right, our 10 minutes are up, so let's rally back together and you on. Okay. So there are another couple of points that I have up there on that slide that you also need to make sure that you include in your deliberations about what is the question that you're going to answer in your integrative review of the literature. Most importantly, you need to decide on your inclusion criteria. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that one hanging for a moment, but you do need to specify your inclusion criteria. And also, you need to justify the years of the literature that you want to search. Now, that can be a little bit tricky. Deciding on the year span that you want to provide as an inclusion criteria for your literature review has to be based normally on some sort of reason. So you have to think about, well, why is it that I would do a review of the literature between this year and that year? Okay, now if we just pick on that group there that wanted to look at some sort of dental material, okay, it's quite a newish type of dental material. Well, it might have only been invented in, I'm making this up, 2005, okay? So if that dental material was released onto the market in 2005, then clearly your literature review would be limited between the years of 2005 and 2012. You wouldn't bother putting any years in before 2005 because it wasn't in existence, was it? Okay? So do you see how you make some decisions about your inclusion criteria? So you need to think that through. Okay, so now we're going to break up your question into keywords, and I'm going to pick on the group up the back because they've chosen an easy question. So can you bring your piece of paper down that you wrote your integrative review of the literature on? And we're going to put it on the document camera, please. And Felicity, can I have a pen? Okay, so now, thank you. Press some more buttons. Let's see if we can get it to work. All right. Ooh, this is all new technology. We're having fun with this. Okay. So the team up the back wrote, are there existing studies on children's perceptions of receiving treatment at a student dental clinic? Okay. So that was the question that the team, I don't know what we're going to call them, the A team, I suspect. The A team came up with up the back, all right? So you need to break up your question into keywords because you need to decide what are the keywords that you're going to put into your search strategies, aren't there? So let's look at this question. So first keyword is going to be children, isn't it? Okay. Second one, we've got student here. What other words could we use for student if we were doing a literature review? Undergraduate, thank you. What else might we ask? Gosh, it's a quiet little group. University. Huh? Novices. Novice. A novice dental clinic? A university dental clinic. What other words are there for university that they use in the United States? College. Okay, you're getting the gist of it? Okay, you need to think about what are the alternative words that you might need to include in your search strategy, in your key terms, all right? So you come up with student, but out of that you've got undergraduate, university and college, all right? Clearly then we would match that with dental clinic, all right? Do they always call them dental clinics in the United States or other countries? Probably, I suspect. Okay, so I think you're probably pretty safe with dental clinic. So that would be more key terms, okay? So really, out of that, that's really what you've got, okay? You haven't got that many key search terms, and you don't really need that many key search terms, because what happens when you put too many search terms into those search engines? Confusion, chaos, vomits up like gazillions of articles, and you go, oh my God, what am I going to do with those? Okay, and then you start panicking about it. So it's really very sensible to think, okay, these are my key search terms, all right. Then you need to make a decision about which databases you're going to search, and you need to learn how to use them. Now, that sounds really obvious, all right, but it's not. I know, because I teach masters and PhD and honours and all these other people that you would figure would know how to use a database, and trust me, they don't, okay? What do you need to do with the databases as a first step? Anybody got any idea? No idea? Nothing? Log in. Now, thank you for that. How are you logging into the database? And then what are you going to log into? Yeah? Okay. One big thing that people don't realise is that you can open an account in those databases. So I know you do log in through JCU. You might pull up Cinal, or that's probably not a good one for you guys. That's a pretty typical one for us. You might pull up Scopus, okay? Scopus is the number one database really for health nowadays. The reason that we use Scopus most of the time is because Scopus is the database that's used by the Australian government to actually judge the quality of publications. So when they're doing calculations about people's what's called an H index as an author, they use the Scopus database. So that has therefore by default turned Scopus into our default database in Australia. So Scopus is where you would start. When you go to the Scopus homepage, top right-hand corner, there's a button there that says log in or create an account. Do that, okay? The reason you do that is because you can save all your searches. So you're not rerunning these things all the time, okay? You can save all your searches if you have your own personal account. You can do the same thing with ProQuest. I imagine you can do the same thing with Medline. So I want you to make sure that you actually, first thing, establish accounts with the databases that you want to search, because you'll save yourself a lot of time. And then you can start to enter in your keywords. Sorry, I didn't realise we hadn't flicked back to my screen. You can then enter in your keywords and start to do what we call a systematic search of the literature. Now, this slide has got an excellent reference on it, Perling and King. It's called A Literature Review, Graduate Nurses' Preparedness, Recognising, Responding to the Deteriorating Patient. Now, it doesn't matter about the topic, okay? I know it's not about dentistry, but that's okay. What it is, it's about the process. This is an excellent example of what an integrated review needs to look like to get you a good mark, okay? So if you get a copy of this journal article and you use it as a template in relation to the tables that they've got in there and the way that they've done the flow chart, the way that they've written up the findings, the way they've discussed those, that is what your paper needs to look like, okay? So this is a very good example. And there's a couple of pictures, really, that I've slotted into this presentation that come from that journal article. So you can see here that Perling and King have put together a nice little flow chart in their literature review that explains what they did, okay? They've got three boxes across the top. They've got their search of electronic databases, and they've basically said, they've come down and they said, oh, well, we found 84 articles that were assessed for relevance, which is what you would come up with out of your key search word term, search, all right? Then we've decided that we're going to discard 60 of those. 24 were further assessed, so that means what they've done is, with the 84, is they've read the abstract pretty thoroughly and they've decided, oh no, actually that title was a bit misleading when I was ticking it in my decision making in the database, it's a bit useless, so I'll throw that out. Then I've read all 24 of the full articles that are left, and then I've decided that 15 of those, after I've read them thoroughly, are not relevant, so I've actually only got 9 articles to include in my review. That's the sort of process that you need to go through. As well as that, they had 2 other sources that they found their literature through. So they had articles identified by experts and also relevant articles identified from reference lists. That's really important. Okay, we call that ancestry and descendancy searching. So if you get a real winner of an article and you say, oh gosh, this was a really good research article, I might like to replicate that study because it was done 15 years ago and it'd be really interesting to see what it was like if we did that study again in today's environment. Or you might say, it was just a really good article, interesting findings, I want to investigate another aspect, but the area that they're talking about is really, pretty much bang on what I want to go and find out more about. Then look at their reference list. Okay, and the other thing you do is you go to the site of the journal where that article was published, pull it up. So say in this case it's the Journal of Clinical Nursing. I would go to the Journal of Clinical Nursing site, and there will be a tab on that page somewhere that says cited by. Okay, so when you click that tab, what you will find is all the other people that have also found Perling and King's article useful and have used it in their journal articles. So that's another way of being able to find some interesting papers that might help you with your lit review. So you need to go through this process. Okay, so when we going back to where we sort of got to here with our list of keywords, and I suppose the first step in that flow chart, we've got, a lot of titles that have popped up on our search that we've done in Scopus. So the first thing you do when you're reviewing the titles and the abstract, so this is your first cut, what I call the first cut of getting through this literature, you need to make sure that you have your inclusion criteria for your literature review printed out on a piece of paper, stuck right next to your computer so that you stay on track, okay? Inclusion criteria are really, really important. Now, you may want to tweak your inclusion criteria, expand it a little bit if you find something that you hadn't really, or, something pops up you hadn't really given much thought to when you first designed them. So that's fine, you can do that. But really try and stay on track. There is no point in looking at journal articles, say if your question was, something about fluoridation in the tablelands, okay? So in a rural community, what are the factors that influence people's opinions of fluoridization, I can't get that one out, in rural communities. And so you've gone through and you've done your searches and you've pulled up all this stuff about rural communities' access to dental services being poor. Well, that's not anything to do with your question, right? Your question is about and rural communities. It's not about how they access health services. So exclude those papers, okay? Stay on track. So keep your inclusion criteria there. Will the findings from these studies answer your question? At this point, once you've sort of done that, you've got your 24, if that was the case, you've sort of pulled out, you've thought, okay, now I've got 24 full journal articles that I want to read. You need to appraise the quality of those journal articles, all right? Because that is really, in effect, your data set in this exercise. That's what you're going to use to analyse other people's findings. So what you need to use is CASP. And we're going to, and I've just put that link there. I'm not going to go to the website at the moment because I've got a little YouTube from a dental school in Sheffield University, which is pretty cool. I have a really good friend who works in the Sheffield dental school over in England, Sheffield University Dental School, who's a sociologist, which I always think is really interesting, Barry Gibson. And he's not a dentist. He's a sociologist that works in the dental school, and he does qualitative research around dental health. So Barry Gibson's stuff is really, really interesting, and his PhD study was actually about the process of decision-making that dentists use in treating people who are HIV/AIDS or HIV positive, or living with AIDS. So interesting stuff. So we do have quite a bit of qual research out there floating around. So when you're actually appraising the quality of your data set, I'd suggest that you make a table, put your articles down the left-hand side, and put the CASP questions, which you're going to see a little bit of in a moment, across the top, and do some ticking. If you pull off that Perling and King article, you'll see a really good example of just that. So it was a table that they used to appraise the quality of the data that they were looking at. So we're going to look now at this using a CASP appraisal checklist YouTube.
So the approach that's used by all of the checklists, no matter which study design, is that the questions in the tools will help you consider the validity of the study, the results of the study, and importantly, how useful those results are going to be for you and your clinical practice. And you will systematically address the validity, the results, and the usefulness of results by working through the questions on the checklists. The first questions on each of the checklists is a screening question. And these will help you decide whether it's worth continuing to do a detailed appraisal of the study, or whether you should just stop there and not waste any more time. And then the detailed questions are then about the specific methodological aspects of the paper that are important, and these will obviously be different for the different study designs. So we're now going to use the CASP checklist for randomised controlled trials and work through the checklist and that will give you an idea of the type of questions involved and how these questions can be applied to a scientific paper. But first, just a brief description of what a randomised controlled trial is. And the main features of these are that participants are randomly allocated to either receive a treatment or to have a control treatment. An example of this would be a study that would evaluate the effectiveness of drinking fluoridated milk by school children and to look at whether it was effective at reducing the levels of dental caries. So a randomised controlled trial of this kind would involve randomly allocating children in schools to either have fluoridated milk or ordinary milk, and those two groups would be examined at the baseline to look at their levels of dental decay, and they would be followed over a certain time period during which they would either have the treatment, the intervention, or they would be a control group. And at the end of the study period, they would be examined again to see whether the dental caries levels were similar in the groups or whether they were different. And by doing that, you would be able to assess how effective that fluoridated milk was in the intervention group. So a randomised controlled trial is a study design that's used to evaluate the effectiveness of an intervention. The screening questions that are used in the checklist for randomised controlled trials start with question 1, which is, did the study ask clearly focused question? So when you were reading the paper, did you understand what the trial was aiming to do? And the second question is, do you think it really was a randomised controlled trial based on your knowledge of what a randomised controlled trial is? And was it appropriate to use a randomised controlled trial to answer the study question? So we need to look at the paper to see whether the trial was randomised and controlled, whether it was aiming to evaluate the effectiveness of an intervention, and whether that aim was clearly written and obvious from reading the paper. And if the answer to those two screening questions is yes, then you will move on to the detailed questions, which is question 3 onwards.
That's the end of it. So basically, the CASP website has a series of checklists that you can go and draw upon. So she talked about the one for randomised control trials. There's also a checklist for qualitative research. There's a checklist for mixed methods. There's a checklist for ethnographies. There's a checklist for systematic reviews. Okay, there's a checklist for a number of different study designs. So you can go to the CASP website, and these checklists are only very short. They're one page, okay? And you can work through the questions that they ask and make some decisions about the quality of the papers. Now, if you make a decision that the quality of the papers isn't high enough, then you would exclude those from your final data set. Okay, so once you've come up with your final data set, you actually need to analyse that. So you need to look at, say, you might end up with, just for the sake of this argument, 15 papers that you've decided that you want to include in your integrative review. So you would, in the first instance, create what I call a working table. So I would put the names of the articles down the left-hand side, and then I would start reading those findings in those papers, and I would code those findings and then create some themes out of those, okay? And then in your working table, I would link the themes with the individual articles. That way you can keep track, I suppose, for want of a better, well, it's a good word to use. You can keep track of which articles you want to include in which sections of your findings. So your findings will be written up around themes, okay? So you need to basically allocate certain papers to certain themes and try not to over-report one particular paper in your findings. Try and get a balance between them. The other thing that you need to create when you're doing your data analysis of journal articles is a summary table that will be included in your final manuscript. And again, that example summary table comes from the journal article I discussed earlier. So those authors use this series of headings in the summary table. First of all, the study. So the first one in the first line was Andrews and Waterman. It was published in 2005. It was from the United Kingdom. Okay. Then the next one across is the aim. So they put the aim of that study into their summary table. The sample, again, very important to make sure that you put that in there because really the sample, I suppose, gives an indication of the quality of and the generalisability of the findings, if they are quantitative ones, to the author at a glance, really. What was the method that was used? The major findings and the strengths and limitations of that paper. And that summary table, the little notations around strengths and limitations is also very important because it demonstrates to the reader that you have done a critical appraisal of the quality of the findings that you've included in your literature review. Any questions about the summary table? Okay, everybody's got that? So it comes to then writing up your integrative review. So what does this thing look like? What's this beast like? In many ways, the headings that are used nowadays in an integrative review of the literature are pretty much the same as would be used in the writing up of a research report. So you've read plenty of those. Okay. Start with an abstract. You need to write an abstract for your literature review. You need to write an introduction for it. You need to have a heading, a subheading, that says search methods. And that's where you need to explain your search strategy. So when we think back on the flow chart that I showed you, that would be where you put the flow chart. Okay. If you wanted to include the summary table of how you appraise the quality of the evidence, that would be where you put that. So you need to really justify, I suppose, the way that you've conducted your integrated review of the literature to the reader. So the methods section is very important. And then you have a findings section. And that's where you present the themes that you've analysed from reading through the journal articles and coding them and categorising some of the sort of overarching themes that are coming out of the findings. After that, you need to discuss the findings in the context of the contemporary literature. So that sounds a bit funny, doesn't it? You're thinking, oh, well, just, discuss the literature, so to speak. So now how do I discuss the literature in the context of the literature? But really, you've treated the literature like a little data set. Okay, so you've analysed those findings. Then you need to also link it to other factors that might have influenced those findings. So in the case of fluoridization, oh, that's a bad word, isn't it? I'm struggling with that one today. Fluoridization. You would then possibly discuss the findings from the, say, other dental studies that have been done around the impact of fluoridization on dental caries or whatever it might be that you come up with. Then you would talk about that in relation to policy documents, government positions, trends in Australia, those sorts of things. Some of that might be in the background to justify why you'd want to do the literature review, but some of it also might be much more useful in the discussion. So you'll need to make a sort of decision about the feel of that once you actually write up the themes from your integrated review. You need to think about the findings overall. So you need to consider things like countries of origin, the countries where the studies were done. How did that impact on the findings that they came up with? Cultural influences, are there any cultural influences that also may have influenced the findings? So the discussion section is where you can explain those sorts of factors, how you think it's made a difference to the findings that people came up with. Types of research designs used. And you also need to talk about the strengths and limitations of the findings that you've included in the data analysis section, okay? So, were the majority of them qualitative studies and therefore unable to be generalised to the wider population? Were most of the studies undertaken in the United States where they have a completely different system of healthcare benefits, so therefore it may not be applicable, some of them, to Australia. So you need to think about those sorts of issues. You also need to critically analyse gaps in the literature that you can see. So some clues for that are, in actual fact, the recommendations from the studies that you've included in the data set. So what did all those authors say needed to be done? Did they themselves, out of their actual research studies, identify that more research needs to be done in a particular way, in a particular area? You know, is there a pattern there that you can also report on and discuss in your discussion section? And you need to identify the need for further research. So in a nutshell, that is all about how to conduct an integrative review of the literature. It's a very, very systematic process. It is a step-by-step process. It's just not as easy as jumping onto Google Scholar and whacking in a couple of search terms, okay? Do that, you just end up in a mess. And we saw a few of those last year, okay? A few train wrecks. So best not have too many train wrecks this year. We actually want you guys to succeed. The idea is to give you the knowledge and skills and the tools to be able to do a really good job, okay? So go and find that journal article because it is a really good template. It'll give you a really nice map about what your article could look like, probably needs to look like, and some really good hints and tips about summarising information in tables, which you know, will add, I suppose, to the strength of your study and hopefully increase its appeal and publishability. It'd be really good to get some of these published this year. I'm very delighted with ours is nearly ready to go out, in fact, for review. And so I think, you know, there's definitely the potential there for you to score a couple of publications. If you're interested in doing honours or going on to a PhD, then being able to get a peer-reviewed publication now in your undergraduate degree will be a really big tick in the box, okay? So it's a good thing to aim for. It's not essential, obviously, to pass your subject, but it's certainly an added little bit of extra, and you've done all that work, so you might as well take it the next step and really bring it home, I think. Are there any questions before we wrap it up today? I'm very happy to answer anything on email. I'm very easy to find on the JCU website. So just send me an email, or if you want to come and get a time with me, I'm also quite happy to do that. I have a wider faculty position, as does Felicity, as Associate Dean Research. So as part of my role, I'm very happy to spend some time coaching and mentoring all of you should you require it. So thank you very much for your time today.